Estás escuchando un audio del Grupo de Investigación Tiempha. Tiempha es un espacio de pensamiento, creación e investigación transdisciplinar que explora las relaciones entre arte, tiempo y ecologías contemporáneas. Este contenido forma parte de nuestras actividades académicas y de divulgación disponibles en nuestra web.
Empezamos con la primera de las conferencias de la jornada. Ahora es la keynote speaker, la doctora Jessica Hemmings. I'm going to start in English. Jessica Hemmings is professor of craft at HDK Valent, University of Gothenburg, and professor too at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. She was the Rita Vollen Fellow at the Research Center for Material Culture in the Netherlands from 2020 to 2023. She edited both the first and second editions of the Textile Reader and Cultural Threads, Transnational Textiles Today. Her recent publications consider extremes of textile labor in science fiction, colonial-era use of scent to suggest factory-produced textiles were handmade, and the work of American artist Faith Ringel, Portuguese artist Leonor Antunes, and Dutch designer Iris van Herpen. Her current research project, Carceral Craft, the Material of Oppression or Expression, is funded by the Swedish Research Council from 2025 to 2027. It's a great pleasure to welcome Jessica Hemmings to Barcelona. Last year, I had the privilege of being mentored by her during a research stay in Gothenburg, and a time I remember with deep gratitude, and also for the conversations we shared and for the generosity with which she accompanied my doctoral journey. And Jessica was among the first voices I encountered as I began my research. And her writing on textiles is not only intellectually compelling, but also a true pleasure to read. So she has been a guiding presence since the very beginning of my PhD, and it's a real privilege to welcome her here today in this faculty and to have the opportunity to listen to you. So thank you, Jessica, for accepting our invitation. And now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Anna, thank you. Thank you so much. Is the sound working okay? Yes, it's good. And thank you to the university for the invitation as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Anna said, we met in Sweden last year, where I work in a faculty which is entirely practice-based. So the arts faculty only conducts artistic research, practice-based research, which Anna and I spoke about quite a bit because my own PhD was written in a literature department. And I think you'll maybe see some traces of this in the things that I'd like to speak about today. I studied woven textile design at RISD in the States, but I became interested in post-colonial literature while I was studying textiles. And so since then, my whole career has been interested in looking at the way textiles tell stories and the way that stories use textiles. I'm an academic, so it's my job to look for what textiles are doing in our culture, in our society. But I've always been interested in when they appear in literature, a writer could choose anything. They could choose cooking, they could choose music. And so some of the things that I look at are what textiles are able to introduce to storytelling, possibly in circumstances where it would not be open or not be possible to say other things. An example of that at the moment is the project that Anna mentioned that's funded by the Swedish Research Council, which is about making textiles in carceral contexts, so in prisons or prisoner of war camps, or some of the early examples I'll show you today, workhouses. In Scandinavia, the term workhouse is a little bit different than in Britain, and maybe you have to teach me in Spain. But a century ago, if you could not, if you had financial problems, if you could not support yourself, or you had committed a small crime, maybe you were put in a workhouse, you lost your freedom. In Scandinavia, my colleagues have taught me this was harder work than being in a prison. In Britain, it's not like that. It's the other way around. So these contexts all represent a loss of the freedom of the body. And the project that I'm working on now is not only historical, it is also contemporary. But I have a reluctance, a concern to ask people to speak about the experience of textiles from a place where they don't have their freedom. That doesn't seem like a fair conversation to me. And so I'm interested in what the textile might say. And so this happens in different ways. It is labor that people are made to make. It is part of the prison sentence, historically and contemporary. It is secrets, covert. I will be able to send you a message, maybe sewing on toilet paper or on my clothing. This is material culture that is the most ephemeral thing I can think of. You know, it is meant to disappear. But information moves inside the prison or inside to outside. And then the last example I can't deny is the same reason that textiles are made outside of the prison. It is for comfort, it is to pass time, it is part of a gift economy to show that you care, that you love other people, or you want to say thank you. So these slides are a little bit of a background to this interest, because I have a lot of respect for all of the research that is interested in the positive things that making textiles brings into our world. But I don't think that's the whole story. And I think that we have a responsibility to also recognize that textiles have and continue to be used to control people and to control people's bodies. Predominantly, my examples look at women's work, but this is not only, this is men and women's bodies. And economics cannot be denied here. So craft, or textile craft in general, it requires patience and usually physical discipline. So we have a lot of information about this work often being relaxing. But I think that the artists that I speak to, I do not weave anymore myself, but a lot of the practitioners that I work with, they talk about also the discipline that their bodies experience in making. It takes a lot of time, and to do a large project, it's not exactly as popular media suggests, which is that it's just like a yoga class. And around the world, but of course we have places that are more extreme, but around the world, craft does not receive a lot of financial recognition. So it doesn't receive financial remuneration. And these could be things that discipline somebody. So Foucault's discipline and punishment. If this is the training you receive in prison, then you are receiving skills which will economically always oppress you. I can't deny that it's also a place of communication and a place of expression. I don't want to get off to such a grumpy start this morning. Everyone's looking at me like, oh my God, this is so depressing. My mother worries about why I am interested in such depressing things. Because there is the other story. And that is, as I said, about gift giving, about love, about care, about saying something I might not be able to say in another way. That could be both inside a prison or beyond, other types of expression. Ingenuity, so creativity, and these things are empowering. So it is I really believe it is both. But I'm bothered and I'm fascinated by the stereotypes that textiles hold. And so one of the reasons why textiles can move in this way in something like a prison is because in a way they're disrespected. So could I bring a radio into a prison or a newspaper or in many cases books? The answer is no, I can't. These things are banned. But thread that is taken from our clothing or something like a women's hobby is overlooked often by the official system and ends up doing the amazing things that radio and writing and other things can do as well. So these stereotypes that dismiss the textile and dismiss women's work are often also the way that it navigates censorship and other types of control. And part of my interest in this is old, but it also really came home to me with a lecture that I listened to by Faith Ringgold. She passed away a few years ago, but the African-American artist, Faith Ringgold, she spoke in London just before lockdowns began and the pandemic hit. And I heard her talk about being commissioned to write her life story by a publisher, a book publisher. And she wrote a story of her life and it was then rejected by the publisher. We only have the artist's version of this story. So I don't know what the publisher would say, but Faith Ringgold said that she felt that as a Black woman, the publisher had expected her to write a story of hardship and horror and all the bad things that life had done to her. And she said, that's not my story. My parents loved me. I had a chance for an education. And so she talks about, you know, that I wasn't raped, I wasn't beaten up, I wasn't thrown out the window. This quote says that wasn't my story. But did this publisher look at me and the way I looked and expect me to tell a certain type of story? So this is, of course, a damning criticism of how we judge people's experience. But what came out of it was she said, okay, I take my story to the place where I have freedom. I publish on cloth. And it was how she started working with these very large quilts that have writing and, of course, imagery on them as well. A place, she says, of freedom that the typical publishing industry would not let her have. This is an homage to Alice Walker's The Color Purple, so the purple quilt with characters, much more literal work. Then we have things that take Ringgold's imagination into the story a bit more. In the United States, Aunt Jemima is a food brand for pancake syrup and things like this. It has changed recently, but it was very, very racially coded. So it was a Black woman with her hair tied up that looked as though she would maybe be a house cleaner or even maybe somebody who didn't have their own freedom in the past. And so in this quilt, Ringgold makes Aunt Jemima an entrepreneur, a business owner of her own. And the text, I know, I'm sorry, it's small. Should we drop the lights a tiny bit to see the slides a bit more? So she empowers that story differently and makes this very racist stereotype into a woman who had financial success and control of her life. So as I told you, I'm interested in the stories that textiles can tell and vice versa. But I'm also interested in other types of communication, which involves the decision to not speak, or silence, or the recognition of things that can't be understood. This is quite an issue for me working on this prison research project. At what point is it a disrespect to say, yeah, I understand. You know, I'm with you. I mean, that it seems more respectful to also acknowledge where I have to stop and say, I can only go so far into this. But this is just a little aside. The cover of the second edition of the Textile Reader. Those of you that worked with publishers will know that you often can't control the cover of a book, even when it's your book, yeah? And I like to warn people that this is a zoom in on the artist's work, yeah? This is the whole work. And it's actually a piece called Language by an Argentine poet and artist, Florencia Wolfish. And I think I understand why the publisher zoomed in. Yeah, I'm not complaining that much, just a little bit. But this is the whole artwork, and it includes all of that open, white, empty space. So if the stitching is also about the noise and the exchange, cacophony, I have no idea what AI will do to cacophony, but the interchange, Florencia also was acknowledging that language is also about these moments of silence and things that can't be said. And I think that all of these examples to show you this morning have that tension in them. There's a lot we can understand, but maybe there is also a lot that is unspoken that we keep thinking about. We don't turn away, but it's not literal. So one of the earliest examples that I've come across of this is Swedish. And the story of this woman is a strange piece of history. She was sentenced to death, allegedly for the murder of her husband, but there are some very strange circumstances around this history. It's not very well understood if this was a crime that she committed. And so this is an early example of stitch work. It's of course written in Swedish, but of her testimony while she was waiting for her life to be taken from her, of the injustice that she experienced, and of her innocence. Here's just a little bit. You can see, I mean, it's a dense text. But some of the translation includes to trap a poor fatherless widow and hurt her family. But you, godless, should still know that I cry, I lament, I suffer. The injustice doesn't cease. How different are the circumstances between the well-to-do, so the wealthy, those that would have had protection in court, and the poor without support. So she turned to stitching, maybe not so different than Faith Ringgold centuries later, to say, no, I'm going to tell my story. The court has not listened. You will take my life. I will die for this crime, but I will leave a record that is my voice. And these are singular voices, so I'm also cautious to say I'm not offering one as more correct than the other, but without them we only have the official voice, or in Ringgold's case maybe the further stereotyping of what one person's childhood would have been. And these are the things that fascinate me. When I said the title of this was Threads of Dissent, I'm interested in angry textiles. I'm interested in the textile not only being about home sweet home, you know, the cliche of domestic happiness. If somebody has domestic happiness, that's wonderful. But we know that the world is full of so much more experiences than only that. And then we also can run into traps, which I'm very happy to admit to you, because once I decide I'm looking for these angry textiles, I see them in places that they're not really there. And this is a bit of a research warning for everyone. So this is now a well-researched, also stitched textile sampler in the Victoria and Albert in London. It also has the silence. It stops in the middle of the cloth. And for a long time, this reads a little bit like a prayer. There are parts of it that suggest that Parker wants her life to end, that she feels suicidal. And then it stops in the middle of the sentence, in the middle of a cloth. So it's got this moment of what happened to this life. Actually, more recently, a historian has found that maybe she just stopped stitching. She actually led an all right life. She died of quite an old age, considering the date of her birth. She didn't marry. She didn't have children, but she raised a sister's child. And this is not actually the story of tragedy that Jessica is looking for. So this is also a little bit of a warning. And for a long time, the history of this cloth was not known. And so the fact that it stops in the middle was taken to be, maybe she did end her life. Maybe this is like a suicide note. But actually, we have to be careful because this story ends differently. But these really are the most literal example of telling stories through cloth. I mean, this isn't visual imagery. This really is dense writing on cloth. If we go forward a little bit, Lorena Bulwer was a woman who was taken to a workhouse, not of her own choice. Her brother took her to the workhouse after their father passed away because she couldn't take care of herself. We don't know what that means. If, as a woman who didn't marry, he wouldn't accept that she would be independent, or she did need more support in life. But she was literate at a time that would have been unusual for their family. And it is thought that the brother shared his school books with her. And she, of course, makes textiles. That's why I show her to you. And somebody had to give her these materials. And it's quite well believed that it would have been the brother. So we have this strange, he took her freedom from her, but stayed in some type of support and contact with her because she has quite varied and rich textiles to work with. So there are several long panels. You can see how this is cut at the bottom. The pieces are now a little bit more assembled. They all have text stitched on them. And these people, maybe you laugh at me now, but I wanted these to also be angry people, yeah, because this is my angry textile project, yeah? So these are my perfect examples. Look, these men are hitting each other. And they're not. So I was able to see these last year, and the text close to them is saying things like hip, hip, hooray. It's a celebration. So they're not my angry textiles, but Lorena's text is angry. It's very densely stitched. The spelling is almost perfect, a very, very large vocabulary. And you can just now see down the far side, they are like scrolls. So they're absolutely huge. And and the back is almost like Morse code. It's as interesting as the front. Sometimes it seems a little bit like fantasy, although I have met a woman who is working on these textiles for her PhD. Maybe they're not so much about fantasy. A lot of it is also words from popular song of the time. But she also says things like this. Who knows what AI is going to do to this now if I read it out. I have wasted 10 years in this damnation hell tramp den of old women, old bags. So she's absolutely furious that she's in this workhouse, that she's not allowed to leave. She condemns damnation hell. She's extremely rude about the other women that are with her. And she also makes suggestions that she might be being sexually abused or that some medical examinations are unnecessary. It's hard to know what she means by this, but there's a lot of anger. Those textiles that they're also very heavy. So if you're in the archive with them, they are quite a thing to hold. So you could imagine the comfort, the weight of having that long piece to stitch in your lap. They're very strong, and they are a little bit of trapunto. They have they're stuffed, quilted. They're not flimsy at all. And I say this because this next example from Germany is a woman who went to the United States as a seamstress, as a tailor, and made a small fortune, a lot of money. But somehow this money might have upset her mental balance, or maybe that's an accident. Maybe that was coming anyway. She returned to Germany and was very fixated on the potential theft of the money, where the money was going, and eventually ended up being taken into a psychiatric hospital. And this is one of her pieces. And I said she made a lot of money as a tailor, and maybe you don't believe me looking at this picture. But this was actually something she made for herself. And she had what today we would call scoliosis of the spine. And so this garment actually perfectly fit her. So her skills were extraordinary. So it looks like it's not exactly the right shape, but it was, if you think about her body rather than a normative body, then this was an extremely accurate piece of work. And it also has text on it, which has something like, I plunge headlong into disaster, one of the translations. It's Old German, and some of it is also drifts into something that's not legible. So moves from handwriting to something that you couldn't perfectly read. But I think the most interesting thing about this is that researchers have found there are far more holes for the needle than were needed. So Agnes seems to have pieced together the jacket from ripped up hospital uniforms. This is really common in a lot of these textiles. They come from the institutional cloth, and stabbed the intricate text. Textile historians detect hundreds of insertions of the needle, far more than is necessary. So maybe there's something emotional being played out in the dynamic with the cloth. I told you the other example, the earlier example of Lorena Buller. It's really heavy in your lap. It felt like a comfort to hold it. Maybe this had another type of emotion being pushed onto the cloth. I want to hope for these things, and I want these textiles to talk to me, because the people can't. But as I said, when I looked and I hoped that those were angry men, and I had to realize just they're happy men, they're not angry men. It's not exactly. So you have to be careful how much you read into these things as well. Here's another example, also from a British workhouse. And now this is extremely perfect, very, very delicate, exceptional work. But the disconcerting, the worrying thing about this is that it was made without other materials available to her. And so she stitched with her own hair. And there is a manifestation of anxiety where you would pull out, really pull, not just pull at, but remove your hair as a stress reaction. And so not all of this, of course, but the most delicate stitches are thread from her own hair, which if you think about it, is also extremely difficult material to work with. We don't have any evidence whether she pulled out her hair as a stress for being without her freedom. Every time she was released, which was often, she was very quickly put back in the workhouse because of problems with alcohol. But I'm not saying that that necessarily explains the two things. And then we move into so many things I have to tell you are the unidentified women. And I don't want to say anonymous. They probably would not have wanted to be anonymous. The HMS Raj convict ship was a route that Britain used to take people that had committed crimes in England, in Britain, and put them in Australia, which was what they referred to as their penal colony. So rather than fill up prisons in Britain, they shipped them to a colony far, far away, something Australians like to always remind the British of today. A lot of genealogy research, so how families link together, has been done because of the ship records. But this is a rare example of collective work. So in your lovely introduction here, you were talking about all of the people involved in your research community. Most of these examples I have to show you are people working alone. And later it becomes because they're in solitary confinement. So this is a really unusual example of collective labor. Quilting big quilts are often done by groups of people. But what is quite nice about this story is that the ship records show that the women had to record their skills when they started the journey to Australia, a very long journey, and when they ended the journey. And more of them at the end said they now have the skills of sewing than they did at the beginning. And so researchers can also see in this that some of the work is very high quality and some of it is very low. People are practicing. And there is also blood on this quilt, which Jessica wanted to be sabotage. Again, more anger. I didn't want to do this. But it's very unlikely that this is what it is. If you think about what they were doing, they were learning to sew on a ship that is moving in the sea. And so they hurt themselves. They pricked their fingers just because the ship is moving while they're stitching. So there is a lack of skill, but there's also the rocking of the boat. A lot of these ships, the Quakers in Britain would provide sewing kits to women who were starting these journeys to help them with the start of their new lives when they arrived. There are also journeys to South Africa, and the same thing would have happened. In the examples of these women, there were so few women when they arrived in Australia that they didn't necessarily go into a prison. There weren't that many prison spaces anyway. So it was more that they started very low paid work in the colony, but also always with the problem that they were a convict hanging over them. Now this one I add because I need everyone's help, because I actually don't know anything about it, and I would love to know more. It's in the Cooper Hewitt collection in New York. Maybe the slide is too small for you to see at the top, but in Spanish it records "Gift of a Sad Prisoner," and this is all I've been able to find. Deirdre would probably confirm super complicated work. I mean, this is not average skill. Actually, none of this that I'm showing you, maybe Bueller, but even then a graphic designer would have an amazing time with sometimes the stitches highlighted. You know, it's very sophisticated. This is also extremely sophisticated technical work. So somebody, again, in the absence of their freedom, recording something about their existence for maybe some type of gift economy, or a record of themselves when we don't have other records. This is the same artifact, but taken with different photographic, different lighting, so it looks a little bit different. Anybody wants to work on this, please come, and I'm desperate to know more. I lived in Indonesia as a child, and so the prison research started because of my interest in this part of the world. And Anna mentioned that I had a Dutch fellowship, which was lovely and difficult because I don't read Dutch. And had a happy accident because I don't read Dutch. So you can imagine that I learned all the Dutch words for women and prison. Batik is a stable word, so this is good. But I was also searching in English. And because I was searching in English and not in Dutch, I came across the black and white image, which is in the Smithsonian collection. And it is, I think, the same textile. I mean, they are physically different artifacts. One is in America, one is in the Netherlands, but they are made in Semarang women's prison in the first decades of the previous century, and the Smithsonian records it as prison work. And because I don't believe it's a coincidence that this could also have been made somewhere else, I started to look more at the Dutch collections, and it's all, a lot of it is, there's a whole set of prison work that the Dutch records have lost, which I thought would be about them hiding the fact that it was made in prison. But actually they were very proud. The Dutch colonized Indonesia at this time, and they were interested in the training they were offering and showing this at world fairs to prove that they ran prisons that were about rehabilitation, about recovery. So this is Semarang Women's Prison at the beginning of the last century, with the batik. Goes through many different steps in its making. And this is not uncommon in colonial prisons. So we have another example in the Philippines. There's a little video that's out on YouTube that you could all look at, that is propaganda. And this is the problem with records around prison work, is that most of it will be about coming from the government, and it will be about how wonderful the government has made the prison. We don't have the voices of what the people inside experienced. So this is needlework in the Philippines. The Philippines are famous for lace work. And there's an amazing piece of research which is about beauty and the fact that this was another form of control. So under US colonial rule, beauty regimes of public schools targeted Filipinas and peasant working classes, weaponizing the US colonial promise of uplift through industrialized handicraft. So we have a question around what I think I am supporting when I purchase this. Is it as much me showing that I support good things, or is it also about the fact that this is always free labor or close to free labor, and so it ends up in the market being less expensive and competing? Do I need to speed up for time? I'm okay. And if we come a little closer, and if you noticed, I didn't say it at the beginning, but I'm trying to step a little bit through the years. I told you also earlier that I do believe that making textiles brings good things to people's lives. But I would like also for us to talk about the ways it has been used in very damaging, controlling ways. And so this is another type of control or workhouse situation in Lisbon, in Portugal. In the 1930s, this also comes from video footage, which is freely available. And it was, among other things, among poverty and small crime, it was also believed that Mitra was used as an internment facility for homosexuals and lesbians for the correction of certain sexual identities. And the idea that, and you can see this woman in the center with her needlework up to her face like this, she can't see what she's doing. So all of these types of textile work do also have these extremely dark histories around controlling identities and adding a certain type of idea of what the right identity is and what the wrong identity is, whether it's about anger, whether it's about sexual orientation, or whether it's about a type of punishment and recovery through a certain type of work. And if I was one of these women, I think I would rather be smashing stones in the courtyard than stitching these detailed things while being accused of something that today we would say that there is absolutely nothing criminal. So a norm that was massively oppressive and punishing. I am interested in women's work. I can't deny this, but I wanted to make sure that this doesn't come across to you only as women's work. So Arcebispo de Rosario was a Brazilian man with an extraordinary life. He was in the Navy. He was a professional boxer, athlete. And then at some point in his life, he believed that he was asked he had a divine message. He was to prepare for the second coming of the Lord. He had a voice tell him this. And he spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital where we believe he was sectioned. He went without his freedom, without his choice. But it is also believed that once he was there, he had quite a lot of space and flexibility. It was understood that he wanted to do this work. And maybe at some point even he could have left and then he chose not to, possibly. But these are bed sheets. So I said before that if family is not bringing these materials, then often it is institutional materials that are used. So the blue thread is coming from the clothing that they were wearing. And these are extraordinary lists that he believes he has been asked to prepare. So letters, names that begin with the letter A. It's a little hard to see, but I told you he was in the Navy. Another one is all sorts of different ships. You know, this basically a type of, what's it called when you have that amazing type of memory? Such an amount of detail. So all sorts of names, all sorts of ships, and different types of records, all with recycled materials from inside the institution. This is back and front that I'm showing you. So the front was full and then the back half full. Julia Bryan Wilson is an American academic. She's based at Columbia now. She has some very beautiful writing on textile practice. And this is her also offering a little bit of a caution. And so she asks, what does it mean if we clean up Bispo de Rosario's history, extract his creations from the state apparatus in which they were made, and redefine them as art? Are we imposing a decontextualized aesthetic framework, pulling them too far away from the brutal reality of the place that they were made? Or are we elevating them to their rightful place? And this clean up in the quotes, she means this quite literally. They were filthy. They were laundered before they were sent to the Venice Biennale. And what does that say about how we remember actually his body in that place that he had to live in at a time that would have been an extremely hard existence? What does it mean when we forget that and look at them and think, aesthetically, they are amazing? Is that the only way we should talk about them? So cleaning up is maybe a type of erasure, a type of removal of something we don't want to think about that's also important. But silence and what we do with silence is also part of Florencia's, the cover that was cut off by the publisher that I showed you, or Agnes McPhee. So this is another example of somebody who lived in an institution for his life, but was given quite a lot of freedom inside the hospital because he was peaceful, because he spent his time making textiles. This is in Scotland, in the north of the UK. And Agnes McPhee's story is a strange one. He, at some point, stopped talking. And medically, there's not a reason why he stopped talking. He was training to be part of World War troops in World War I. He didn't ever go into combat. And so it was as though he had a trauma without actually seeing the war. And from that, he had to leave the military, and he made these extraordinary artifacts from memory, from braiding traditions that are on the Scottish Islands when other materials are so expensive. And from memory is also very important in prison contexts. If everything is taken away from you, but I remember this pattern, or in his case, he seems also to have this ability to make very complicated shapes without any training. Most of these are replicas. So this was work that he made, and then he let it be burnt in the gardens. He didn't show any care after it was made. It was the making that was important. So this is made of things that will biodegrade very quickly. But I mean, here you can see the collar, and the top is very complicated. So we don't know. But something in his childhood he carried forward as a comfort, and he could speak. Now and again he did, so he chose not to. This is something elected, quite different than most of these other examples where a family or a legal system takes someone's freedom away. So just a few more, bear with me. So now we are in apartheid era South Africa. If Agnes McPhee somehow dealt with a trauma by withdrawing from society, Ruth First was put in solitary confinement because of her opposition to apartheid, an anti-apartheid campaigner, and South Africa had a law that you could be kept for 90 days without a reason. Then you would be released. And as you were walking down the street away from the prison, they would arrest you again for another 90 days. They don't need to have a reason. And they keep doing this to try to stop political dissent. And so she makes a calendar when she's in solitary confinement to count the time and to keep her sanity. She says that I felt like I was pushing time on, creating days, weeks, and months. And she was held for 117 days. Solitary confinement is meant to break people mentally so that they stop causing the state problems. So she really fought against that. And again, some has been written about the fact that she was a white South African. She had a bit more freedoms as far as access to a needle, but she still takes the thread from her clothing. Her life later, she lost her life in a letter bomb. So they eventually did succeed in ending her life. This type of work continues in South African prisons today, and this is the research I'm doing now. These pieces of cloth are testament to an area in the city of Cape Town where segregation caused forced removal. And the District 6 Museum tries to hold those family histories of the culture and the peace that people lived together happily until the segregation forced the removal. The museum learnt that all of these messages that had been signed were fading with a pen. And so they came up with a project to ask people in Pollsmoor prison to stitch over them to hold the traces for longer. So here you can maybe see the chain stitch that sits on top of the text. But there's a lot of myth around this as well. So when I met the museum director, she said, oh, I think the project stopped because those prisoners, they were stealing the needles. And again, I thought, oh, I don't know, this is a good story. Let me look into this. Eventually, I found the woman who had run the project. And she said the project stopped because they ran out of funding. So there were no needles stolen. And this comes up a lot in the memoirs. I also read that, like, from one perspective, these materials seem to have a threat around them. You could swallow the needle to hurt yourself, to get into the hospital, and there's no evidence of that from the other side. What is interesting is this was kept in the prison cells with the women. Anna mentioned that I have a real interest in textiles and scent. We talk a lot about textiles and touch, but I'm interested in textiles and scent. It happened during COVID when I wore my mask everywhere. And so these textiles stink of cigarettes and are also burnt and damaged because they really lived with the prisoners, which is interesting if you think about Julia Bryant Wilson asking, do we clean up Bispo de Rosario too much when we take his textile to Venice and have it made like we want art to look? Two more examples, and then I promise I'm finished. So this has all been very dark, and I told you my mother in particular wishes I would research things that are more cheerful. But in amongst this darkness, I also I'm very interested in acknowledging that textiles are about empowerment. They can be totally about oppression, but they do offer moments also of extreme empowerment. This is also an anonymous piece. It is a bag, a cotton sack that we think comes from around 1850, but the stitches come from later. And it was stitched by Ruth Middleton. And she talks about the fact that this was a bag that was in her family, and her female relatives in her family, probably her whole family, were enslaved people in America. So my great-grandmother Rose, the mother of Ashley, gave her this sack at the age of 9 in South Carolina. It had a dress, 3 handfuls of pecan nuts, which are harvested in that part of the country and extremely nutritious. So if you were trying to take a covert journey to the north for your freedom, you could live for quite a long time on this small amount of food. It be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother. So this is some type of record of survival of a family tree, despite the conditions that people who were enslaved lived under, and some testament to a lineage that's broken, but the message of love being passed on nonetheless. And then the last example I have is an extraordinary story of forgiveness, in the case of something that you would imagine actually should be the classic example of total anger or fury. But this woman, Jan Roof aan Hun, was one of a number of Dutch people who were kept in Japanese internment camps during Japanese occupation of Indonesia during World War II. The break that really disrupted Dutch colonial power, and at the end of this, eventually Indonesian independence was recognized. It was called earlier, but recognized by the Dutch. In between, there was Japanese occupation. And these are textiles that are stitched again with women's names and dates and the camps where they were kept. And this particular woman, Jan aan Hun, was kept with a group of very young women in a comfort house. and they were repeatedly raped by the Japanese military, who used this as a sanctioned brothel, as a place that the military set up for them. You might have heard the expression so-called comfort women by military forces. So this is a record that they survived, and that they were held together in this situation. They were very young, and there's some extraordinary record also of when they were being selected by the military. Some slightly older women came forward and offered themselves and said, please, like, take me instead of that 13-year-old. Save her this for now. But this woman and many others, they have spent the rest of their lives, she has now passed away, but campaigning for peace and forgiveness. So she also traveled to Japan, and met with family members and spoke about this experience and offered her forgiveness even of this type of experience. Pretty astonishing. And so here, and this is where I end. I said the title of this talk, Threads of Dissent. I think you can see, yes, sort of this anger against official systems, or at least, please hear my voice in contrast to the official voice. And now here in these last examples, we have two situations where I think anger could be extremely well justified. The enslavement of people over generations and the breaking apart of families, or sanctioned sexual violence, official sexual violence. But in both cases, anger is not what these textiles offer. They offer witness. They offer a memory that we cannot pretend this did not happen. But the actual individuals also are offering us a different message, and that is one of survival, or even in this case, one of forgiveness and a plea. And unfortunately, it's extremely important at the moment of peace, that war cannot ever be the solution. And these are textiles. So we know we have newspaper, we know we have radio, but I would like to add that this is also, these textiles were stitched. Needles were not available. They had to sharpen a piece of metal on a rock or use something else. Sometimes it comes from pieces of a hair comb. This is not simple things to construct in these contexts. But maybe even more important is the message that they have sent, which I think doesn't sit in 1942 or 1944, but is very, very contemporary as well. So thank you for listening, and